All right, guys, welcome back to the table to discuss some theology videos. Appreciate y'all joining.
Yeah.
So we're going to begin in this series of videos talking about sin, the nature of sin, the origins of sin, the extent of how sin works in our lives as believers, even the extent of how sin is at work in the world and people in general. And so we'll cover a lot of topics, but we're going to start with the most important one as we think about sin, is the origins of sin. There's a lot of questions that pop up on where does sin come from? Why do people sin? I don't think there's any question. Maybe we start there. There's not a question that sin exists in the world. Would you agree with that?
I think it's without question.
Yeah.
I mean, I think if you just are a human and walk around and watch TV or know yourself or live with anybody, you see sin.
Look at myself in the mirror.
Yeah, but...
Well, I'm a father of three,
Okay.
and I'm a kids pastor. And
That's
so
right.
my favorite example of this is always the fact that you never have to teach a child, not one, how to be bad.
You don't.
You have to teach every single one of them how to be good.
That's right.
Yeah.
Which would say it's in our nature
That's right.
to sin. And so the question would be, why is that? Why do humans sin? Why are humans sinners, right? That's two different questions, right? But why do humans sin and why are humans sinners? What are the origins of this? Where would we start? Or maybe where should we start in thinking about that?
Well, I think you have to go to Genesis 3.
Okay, so Genesis 3.
Where sin comes into the world.
So give us a summary of Genesis 3. What happens in Genesis 3?
In Genesis 1 and 2, God creates the heavens and the earth and all that fill them. On day 6, He creates man in His image, and for whatever period of time, man is with God in the garden. I guess you can look at our previous videos on that to think through that. At some point, the serpent enters into the garden, deceives the woman, deceives the man to sin against God.
So at the rebellion against God's command in the garden, we see mankind enter into sin.
Right.
One of the questions that's often asked, Nick, I'd love to get your thoughts on this, is, why would God put a tree in the garden that is restricted to begin with? Isn't that just kind of tempting man to sin against God? Why did God do that? If God didn't want us to sin, why not give access to all, or just get the tree out of the garden?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things to note in that. Number one, dispelling the false idea that I think a lot of people have that don't know that they have this idea that there's something magical about the fruit itself.
Yeah, right.
That God put this magic fruit that does. So it has to be something that's representing something. The reason why God is putting that there is to represent something that could or could not happen. Number one, and then number two, another bad idea is that God is putting it there as a test for which He does not know the answer yet. Right?
Yeah.
He has to put it there to see what they're going to do.
To see what will happen.
Yeah.
That's good. It's a good distinction.
Yeah, so I think once we get those out of the way, any Orthodox Christian that believes that God is all-powerful and all-knowing has to acknowledge that God knew what was going to happen, and yet He had a reason for it to be there.
Okay.
So I feel like that's on the table for everybody. No matter where you land theologically, you have to say, He knew, He put it there for a reason, and He knew exactly what was going to happen, and He did it anyway.
That's right, because the only other alternative to that would be to say that He didn't know what they would do.
That's right.
In that case, we'd be venturing into what's called open theism,
Yeah.
where God is really not God who is sovereign, omniscient, all-knowing. He's basically learning
That's
as
right.
things unfold. That you just can't read the Bible and walk away with that conclusion.
That's right. Well, so it's twofold. So either He didn't know, or He did know and He was powerless to stop it.
Right.
And as Jonathan Edwards, my favorite theologian, says on this topic, he says that for God to allow something, if He's all powerful and all knowing, is for Him to will it.
Right.
And for Him to will it is for Him to decree it. So the ultimate answer to the question of why did God put the tree in the garden, knowing that Adam and Eve were going to sin, is because He decreed that it would be so.
That's right. So we'll make our way there, I think, in a moment some further. I think we're going to be diving further into that idea. Brandon, here's a question for you. So we see that man falls in the garden, Genesis 3, right? You just mentioned that. We just saw that man rebels against God, eats the forbidden fruit. But here's the question a lot of people like to ask. Where did Satan come from? Because obviously there's been some kind of rebellion.
Yeah.
Because we get a creature showing up who is trying to work against God.
Right.
So up to this point in the text, we've only read about God's creative acts. We see that it's good, it's good, it's good. The first marriage unfolds. And now all of a sudden there's an enemy. There is a detractor of God who's questioning God's word. So where does Satan come from?
Well, what's interesting is that Genesis 3 is not the introduction of sin, it's the introduction of sin into mankind.
That's good.
So what we see here is sin is already present because we have someone who is sinful there in the garden with man who is not yet sinned.
Yeah, we have a rebel present.
Right. So sin is already present, and he's the one who introduces temptation, which causes sin to mankind. But by implication, we have to understand this to say that he was once good and then became bad, because otherwise God would have created him evil.
And everything in the first 2 chapters of Genesis demonstrates that all that's been made is good, including the heavenly beings and the things on earth, right?
Yeah, so something has taken place between God's initial acts of creation and this moment we have now with the serpent in the garden.
So we don't see it in Genesis 1 and 2 itself.
No.
Where do we get the idea then at some point Satan fell? Who is Satan? I guess would be a good question.
Well, theologically, by implication, at some point he fell. And so then we can piece together some other biblical text. Luke, Jesus says in Luke that I saw Satan fall from heaven. There's also a really interesting text in Ezekiel where Ezekiel talks about the king of Tyre. And I'll just hit that real quick.
And as you're turning there, I think it's important to emphasize that we know Satan also as Lucifer. Lucifer was once an angel. We read in Job, which is the oldest book of the Bible, by most scholars' estimation.
Right.
Satan showing up, already a rebel, already the tempter, right? So the question becomes, how did he get this way?
Yeah, so there's an interesting text here, and there's another one in Isaiah 14, but Ezekiel 38 or 28 says of the king of Tyre. So the prophet's talking about a person, a human being, but it can't just be him, because it says things like this, talking about the king: you were the signet of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. Then he goes on to say, you were in Eden, the garden of God.
Right.
So the king of Tyre,
we know that king wasn't there.
Right, and he goes on to say that verse 15, verse 14, you're an anointed guardian cherub. Cherub being an angel. I placed you. You were holy on the mountain of God in the midst of the stones of fire. You walked. You were blameless in your ways until unrighteousness was found in you. So when you start to piece together these biblical texts, you get this picture that Satan was an angel, a cherub, perfect. He was beautiful, and then at some point God found sin in him.
And most people believe that sin was a pride. It was a desire to be worshipped, right?
Yeah.
It was a desire to be like God.
That's right.
Ultimately, and that's what he tempted Adam and Eve with, right?
It says in verse 17, your heart was proud because of your beauty.
Yeah.
You corrupted wisdom for the sake of your splendor. I cast you to the ground. I exposed you before kings. So it seems that he had pride in his heart, and because of that, God cast him out of heaven. And then we see in later New Testament texts that a whole host of angels went with him too and became demons.
That's right.
So when you put this is what we do in systematic theology. This is how we get a doctrine of demons, a doctrine of Satan.
That's good.
We start to put together all these texts, and we reason and we think through them, and we come up with this idea that Satan was an angel who fell.
Yeah. So, and this is where obviously Paul talks about we're not in a battle against flesh and blood alone. These are the principalities that we're talking about. So Nick, here's a natural question I think pops up. So, okay, we've accounted for how Satan shows up in the garden, right? He's an angel who has fallen. We get some background in other passages, the prophetic writings of Ezekiel. God reveals the origins of Satan's fall. But here's the question. That implies then that God created a being who could fall and possibly even knew would fall. So again, going back to what you were even kind of hinting at a while ago, is this accidental? Does God know that Satan's going to do this? Why does God create a world where Satan can fall? What are your thoughts on that?
So I don't want to give away too much that we're going to talk about in the next question we're going to answer, but the ultimate answer is one that our sinful flesh doesn't like. God created a world wherein not only would evil be possible, but that evil would be present for His own glory. Yeah. Because out of the evil that He has ordained in the world, He is accomplishing the highest good. And we don't like that. We think that does something to the character of God. Right. But it only does something to the character of God if we have a faulty view of what the character of God is. If we have a view of the character of God that says that He can't ordain bad for the ultimate good, well, then he's not the problem. Our view of who he is the problem.
That's right.
Yeah.
And that's where I ultimately land is not that it's just something we toss into the mystery bucket, but again, we've talked about it before in Deuteronomy. He says that the secret things belong to the Lord our God. The revealed things belong to us and to our children. And so if God has plans that he doesn't tell us about, we can't disparage him for not telling us the specifics of why he does things the way he does. We have to, as you've said before, when we can't trace his hand, we have to trust his heart. And I think that applies to this question of evil in a lot of senses.
So I think to summarize this, then, we would say when we think about the origins of sin, we know that we find man's origins of sin in the garden. Mm-hmm. We know that man is tempted and led astray by a serpent who we know is Satan or Lucifer or the devil. That roaring, right, that prowling lion seeking to devour. His origins, obviously, then we talked about, is that he's an angel, created good, who fell. Right. But then that ultimately brings us back to the bigger question, which is, are we talking about a God who didn't know that this was going to happen and learned as it went, which we just can't justify biblically? Yeah. Right. Or is this a God who made this world and even ordained that this kind of world would be where these kind of creatures would exist and that some of these creatures would indeed sin and rebel and fall against him, bringing about the world we see today? Yeah. For bigger purposes, right? And we could talk about that some more in another video, but what that leads us to the conclusion of is that even sin is under the sovereignty of God.
That's right.
Absolutely.
Even sin is under the sovereignty of God, which means there's nothing that is ever outside of his sovereignty.
That's right.
If there was something outside of his sovereignty, that thing itself would have more power than God.
That's right. Well, in Ephesians 1:11, that he works all things according to the counsel of his will. All things is all things. Yeah. But just going back to what you said just a moment ago, here's the choices that are on the table. Everybody, no matter where you are in faith, whether you're Arminian camp, Molinist camp, and we can talk about some of that later, even if you're an atheist and agnostic, everybody has to answer the question of the origin of evil, because everybody, even the one who doesn't believe in God, acknowledges that evil is a thing, that evil exists. And so the options that are on the table is, if you're an atheist, you don't have an origin for evil because evil has no referent point, right?
That's right.
So nothing can really be evil. It's just all opinion.
It just all is.
And then within the camps of faith, either God doesn't know how to stop evil, God didn't know evil was going to happen, God created a world in which evil was possible, knowing that it would happen, and he created it anyway, or God created a world in which evil has a good purpose.
Right.
Those are the options. Nobody gets off the hook for it.
That's right. And even if you try to say God made the world where it could, but he didn't necessarily ordain that it would, you're still saying that he's ordaining, though, a world that could fall.
Knowing that it would.
Knowing that it would, right?
So he's still ordained it.
And he could have ordained it not to fall.
That's right.
Right? So you're still back in the same boat of then why this way?
That's right.
And I think it's important to know, I think one of the reasons we have such a problem with the idea that God would make a world where sin is not only possible, but and we'll talk about this later, he ordains it to come, is because we think God's highest goal is to either, one, give us absolute free will,
right,
or it's to create a scenario in which we try to do our best and then he'll fix it, if we screw up. Where actually the Bible says God's highest goal is to glorify himself.
That's right.
And if sin requires that, and we'll talk about how sin does require it, because the sin is what causes the cross to come, and the cross is what glorifies God the most.
That's right.
So God's priorities are not necessarily what we think they should be, and that's what our starting point in this whole conversation needs to be adjusted towards.
That's right.
Is God's glory, and God's highest goal is to maximize his glory.
That's great.
And we're the benefactors of that.
Right. And we win from that.
Yeah.
Okay, well, this would be a good stopping place for this conversation on the origin of sin. We'll dive deeper into some of these subjects in the videos.
Looking forward to it.
Yep.